Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believe, your values, your truths, your sense of right and wrong, was never truly yours. Not the opinions you defend, not the fears that keep you awake at night, not even the dreams that pull you forward. You awaken in a familiar room, surrounded by objects that once defined your identity. The books you read, the icons on your phone screen, the news outlets you trust, the influencers you follow. But suddenly they all appear foreign, hollow reflections of something deeper, something you can no longer name. You try to trace the origin of your beliefs, the lineage of your convictions, and find only a long chain of borrowed thoughts, echoes of a collective hypnosis disguised as certainty. The realization hits like a quiet apocalypse. You've been living inside a cathedral built from other people's words. You sit there, paralyzed by a question that splits your mind open. When did you stop thinking for yourself? Was it when you first learned to obey authority? When comfort began to outweigh curiosity? Or was it subtler? When the world around you began rewarding conformity more than truth? Everywhere you look, people are worshipping. Not in temples or churches necessarily, but in digital shrines of ideology, celebrity, and convenience. They kneel before screens, algorithms, and brands that promise belonging. They chant the mantras of political correctness, economic optimism, or self-help salvation. They raise idols, some human, some corporate, some conceptual, and mistake them for truth. And in this worship, the mind begins to die. But here's the paradox that gnaws at your sanity. The more information we have, the less we seem to know. The Age of Enlightenment was supposed to free humanity from ignorance, yet we drown in data while starving for understanding. Everyone speaks, few think. Everyone reacts, few reflect. Everyone seeks validation, not wisdom. How did we get here? How did knowledge, once the highest pursuit, become a commodity and truth a matter of branding? Perhaps it began with the subtle promise of ease. The promise that someone else could think for you. A system, a government, a trend, an expert. You traded effort for efficiency, reflection for repetition, and truth for whatever sparkled brightest on your feed. And the terrifying part? You didn't even notice the trade. You scroll endlessly, consuming curated outrage and algorithmic affirmations, believing you're staying informed, but in truth, you're being formed, sculpted by forces that know more about your mind than you do. Each click, each share, each dopamine pulse is another small surrender, until one day you mistake the reflection of your programming for your personality. You might protest, but I'm educated. I think critically. Yet critical thinking is not education, it's rebellion. It's the courage to question even your most sacred beliefs. It's the willingness to stand naked in uncertainty while the world demands allegiance to certainty. And that is the great modern heresy, to think independently in an age of collective noise. Because ignorance today no longer looks like the absence of knowledge, it looks like the worship of knowledge's illusion. It looks like mistaking confidence for truth, popularity for wisdom, and convenience for understanding. Ask yourself, when was the last time you truly examined your own beliefs without the safety net of a group or ideology? When was the last time you allowed doubt to disturb your peace rather than suppress it? When was the last time you listened to silence, unmediated by the chorus of opinions? You might find that your mind, once thought free, is a prisoner in a beautifully decorated cage. A cage built not by force but by seduction, the seduction of certainty, belonging, and the approval of the tribe. The tragedy is not that people are ignorant, it's that they are proud of their ignorance, mistaking conviction for clarity. They defend their idols, be they political, spiritual, or intellectual, with religious fervor, unable to see that every idol by nature demands the death of inquiry. And when inquiry dies, civilization follows. We no longer burn books. We bury them beneath endless distraction. We no longer fear censorship. We fear being unfollowed. The flames of ignorance burn quietly now, in the glow of every screen, in the echo chambers of every ideology, in the comfort of every unchallenged assumption. And yet beneath the noise, something ancient stirs, a whisper that refuses to die. Think for yourself. But to do that, you must first confront the one truth modernity cannot tolerate, that most of what you believe is inherited illusion, that your idols are not saviors, but substitutes for understanding, that ignorance wears the mask of enlightenment, And idolatry hides behind the language of reason. The question, then, is not whether you are free, but who benefits from your belief that you are. And so, you sit in the dim light of your realization, feeling the weight of invisible chains. The world continues its worship, its digital liturgies and algorithmic sermons, while you begin to see through the veil. You begin to sense that ignorance and idolatry are not relics of the past. They are the twin engines of the present. The question that lingers like a haunting: what happens to a world that stops thinking but keeps believing? That question is the doorway. Beyond it lies something far more unsettling, a revelation about why the human mind clings to illusion even when truth stands at the door. And that is where our descent begins into the hidden roots of ignorance itself. There is a reason ignorance persists, even in an age that glorifies intelligence. It's not a failure of education or technology. It's a failure of the soul. Ignorance at its root is not the absence of information. It is a defense mechanism, a fortress the psyche builds to protect itself from truths too heavy to bear. Beneath every unexamined belief lies fear, fear of uncertainty, of insignificance, of chaos. To think critically is to expose yourself to the unbearable light of reality, and most minds, fragile, conditioned, exhausted, flinch before that light. Carl Jung once wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Ignorance is precisely that absurdity. It's not stupidity. It's self-preservation. The psyche attempts to maintain coherence in a world too fragmented to comprehend. We cling to idols, ideologies, leaders, brands, dogmas, because they give our chaos form. They tell us who we are and what we should hate. They offer certainty where truth offers ambiguity, and ambiguity is intolerable to the modern mind. You see it everywhere. In politics, where nuance dies in favor of slogans. In culture, where identity is worn like armor. In science, where complexity is simplified for comfort. We are addicted to the illusion of clarity because it soothes our existential anxiety. Nietzsche called this the will to truth, but he didn't mean the pursuit of truth itself. He meant the will to believe we know the truth even when we don't. Truth in its raw form destabilizes. It doesn't comfort, it shatters. It demands that you question everything you stand on, even the ground of your own identity. And so we construct idols to guard us from that terror. We make gods out of ideas, doctrines, even scientific paradigms, not because they're true, but because they make the world bearable. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that consciousness itself is a kind of curse, the awareness of suffering, futility, and the relentless striving of life. Ignorance then becomes anesthesia. To question too deeply is to risk madness, and so humanity collectively chooses sedation over awareness. The modern sedative is not opium as it was in Marx's time. It is distraction, screens, ideologies, dopamine-driven validation loops. We have mistaken stimulation for meaning, but beneath the glittering noise lies something older, darker, the human fear of nothingness. Jean-Paul Sartre called it nausea, that dizzying awareness that the universe has no inherent order, that meaning must be created, not found. Most people never recover from that realization. They retreat into the comfort of collective delusion, where belief replaces inquiry and identity replaces essence. This is the hidden psychological wound, humanity's addiction to meaning, even when the source is false. We are not designed to live in uncertainty for long. The brain, according to neuroscientists, despises cognitive dissonance. When faced with contradictory information, it doesn't seek truth, it seeks relief. And relief is found not in discovery but in denial. That's why conspiracy theories thrive, why political cults rise, why misinformation spreads faster than insight. These are not failures of logic, they are triumphs of psychology. They give the anxious mind a story, a villain, a sense of belonging. They turn chaos into narrative. Ignorance, therefore, is not a void, it's a structure. A psychological architecture built to protect us from the unbearable freedom of thinking for ourselves. Viktor Frankl, who witnessed humanity's descent into madness during the Holocaust, observed that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. The tragedy of the modern age is not that we've lost our why, but that we've filled the void with false ones. We worship success, productivity, and self-expression, but we no longer ask what any of it means. Our idols whisper that progress equals purpose, that comfort equals happiness, that opinion equals truth. And so we march on, educated, informed, and profoundly lost. To understand the roots of this condition, one must look beyond culture into the architecture of the mind itself. The ego, Jung's fragile monarch, cannot exist without opposition. It defines itself through contrast. I am not them. Every idol, therefore, is a mirror for the ego's survival. When we worship, we are not venerating the object. We are affirming the self. The celebrity, the ideology, the nation, the faith, they are all projections of our desire to belong, to matter, to exist in a way that feels absolute, and yet that desire becomes the trap, because the more we cling to these external validations, the less we can tolerate inner confrontation. The individual dissolves into the collective, trading self-awareness for solidarity. Jung called this participation mystique, the merging of identity with the group mind. It's comforting, yes, but deadly to thought. In that state, one no longer thinks, one belongs, and belonging in our time has become the new faith. Our society rewards conformity disguised as virtue. The algorithms amplify whatever aligns with the tribe's narrative and silence what challenges it. The workplace, the classroom, the social sphere, they all subtly penalize dissent. Independent thought is branded as arrogance, skepticism as negativity, and detachment as apathy. We are told to stay informed, but what that truly means is stay aligned. This is the hidden machinery of ignorance. It doesn't operate through censorship or oppression, but through reward. The dopamine hit for agreement, the social validation for ideological purity, the comfort of being on the right side. These are the psychological bribes that keep the mind enslaved. And so, we arrive at the paradox. We believe we are freer than ever, yet we have never been more intellectually domesticated. We wear the language of freedom like a badge, while obeying invisible scripts written by culture. Commerce and fear, the great thinkers of history, Socrates, Spinoza, Galileo, were persecuted not because they were wrong, but because they dared to think in public. Today, persecution is subtler. It comes not with fire or exile, but with ridicule, cancellation, and digital erasure. The tools have changed, but the fear remains, the fear of standing alone with one's own mind, and so ignorance persists, not as darkness, but as light too blinding to question. The modern idol is not carved from stone. It is coded in algorithms, wrapped in ideology, broadcast in high-definition clarity. We don't bow before it, we scroll. We don't pray to it, we post. And with each gesture, we surrender a fragment of our autonomy, mistaking engagement for awareness. But what if this ignorance has consequences beyond personal stagnation? What if, beneath the psychological comfort, it is quietly reshaping the world itself? The mind's blindness does not end at the individual. It seeps into institutions, relationships, even the moral fabric of civilization. And that is where we must go next, into the realm of unseen consequences, where ignorance becomes not merely a state of mind, but a force that governs destinies. Ignorance, left unexamined, does not simply sit idle in the mind, it metastasizes. It becomes the invisible architect of civilization, shaping laws, economies, relationships, and even the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. You cannot see it directly, but you can feel its fingerprints everywhere. In the apathy that passes for peace, in the outrage that substitutes for understanding, in the hollow certainty that masquerades as moral clarity. We like to believe that ignorance is a personal flaw, a failure of curiosity. But it's far more systemic, more insidious. It becomes culture itself, a collective hypnosis that determines what is real, what is valuable, and what must never be questioned. And because it feels familiar, we mistake it for truth. Look closer. Everywhere society rewards those who conform to the dominant narratives and punishes those who deviate. But these narratives are not static. They shift like tides, driven by invisible economic and psychological forces. Today's heretic becomes tomorrow's prophet, and today's virtue becomes tomorrow's vice. The cycle continues, not because truth changes, but because ignorance demands constant idols to replace the ones it destroys. We see it in politics, where partisanship functions not as a pursuit of justice but as a substitute for meaning. People no longer debate to understand, they debate to exist. To disagree is not merely to have a different perspective, It is to commit a moral crime. The political arena has become a theater of identities, where ignorance wears the mask of righteousness and moral outrage becomes the new liturgy. And beneath it all, the machinery hums quietly, the algorithmic gods feeding us precisely what keeps us divided, outraged, and engaged. The consequence is not just polarization, it's spiritual erosion. The more certain we become, the less capable we are of empathy, because certainty is sterile. It leaves no room for wonder. Ignorance has evolved from a lack of knowledge to a weaponized form of knowledge, a curated narrative that keeps society manageable. Every empire, every ideology, every digital platform thrives on this manipulation of perception. The ancient kings used religion to keep their subjects obedient. Modern corporations use attention. The principle remains the same. Control the lens and you control the mind, and yet, the most terrifying part is how willing we are to participate. We share our thoughts, our habits, our preferences, feeding the algorithms that sculpt our realities. Each click trains a machine to know us better than we know ourselves, and so our digital reflection begins to replace our authentic consciousness. We no longer choose what we believe. The system predicts it, packages it, and sells it back to us as individuality. The philosopher Aldous Huxley foresaw this with eerie precision. He warned that the future would not be defined by tyranny through pain, as Orwell imagined, but by tyranny through pleasure. People would love their servitude, distracted by comfort and entertainment, incapable of rebellion because they would not see the chains. That prophecy is no longer speculative, it's statistical, but the consequences extend beyond technology. Ignorance, when normalized, seeps into the ethical bloodstream of humanity. It dulls our moral perception. It teaches us to look away from suffering that does not serve our narrative. It allows entire systems of exploitation, economic, ecological, political, to thrive behind a veil of complexity. We tell ourselves the world is too intricate to fix, that corruption is inevitable, that individual effort is futile. That's the genius of systemic ignorance. It doesn't need to convince you to approve, it only needs you to stop asking questions. And when questioning dies, so does accountability. This quiet death of thought reshapes everything, from personal relationships to planetary ethics. Consider how modern love is mediated by screens, apps, and metrics. The human heart is now gamified. Swipe left, swipe right, reward, discard. Connection becomes consumption. We mistake communication for intimacy, attention for affection. And beneath the surface, a silent epidemic grows. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of disconnection. From the self, from meaning, from truth. People are surrounded by others, and yet utterly alone because true connection requires presence, and presence requires thought. Ignorance has even rewritten time. The constant influx of data fragments our attention, reducing the depth of experience. We live in a state of perpetual reaction. Our minds hijacked by the latest headline, the next outrage. The present moment becomes unbearable, unless mediated by stimulation. We no longer experience reality. We scroll through it. Philosophers like Martin Heidegger warned that technology would not just change the tools we use, it would change our being. It would train us to see everything, including ourselves, as resources to be optimized. And that is precisely what has happened. We no longer ask, what is good? We ask what works. Efficiency has replaced wisdom. Productivity has replaced purpose. This transformation has consequences so subtle that they escape notice. The collapse of attention leads to the collapse of memory, and the collapse of memory leads to the collapse of meaning. Without the capacity to reflect, we cannot learn. Without learning, we cannot evolve. Humanity begins to drift, guided not by vision but by inertia. The psychological toll is devastating. Anxiety, depression, and existential numbness rise not merely from chemical imbalances, but from spiritual ones. The human psyche, deprived of depth and reflection, begins to rot. The result is a generation that feels everything and understands nothing, a generation drowning in emotion but starving for coherence. This is not accidental. It is the logical outcome of a civilization that worships noise over silence, consumption over contemplation, image over essence. When you build a world that rewards distraction, you breed people incapable of thought, And yet we still call it progress. We applaud technological advances while ignoring their psychic costs. We celebrate the democratization of information without questioning the degradation of understanding. We conflate access to knowledge with wisdom itself, but wisdom requires stillness, something the modern world treats as failure. The unseen consequence, then, is not merely ignorance but the normalization of ignorance. A society that no longer realizes it is blind cannot seek vision. We have reached a point where mediocrity is celebrated as authenticity, where outrage is mistaken for moral depth, and where the death of critical thought is applauded as social harmony. The result is a civilization that appears intelligent but behaves like a cult, reverent, reactive and terrified of doubt. And here lies the cruelest paradox of all. Ignorance gives us comfort, but that comfort is fatal. It shields us from the pain of awareness, but also from the possibility of transformation. It creates order, but at the cost of truth. If this pattern continues, if idolatry replaces inquiry and convenience continues to numb the mind, the future will not collapse in fire, but fade in apathy. The death of thought is not loud. It's quiet, polite, and anesthetized. But the story doesn't end here. For within every system of control lies the seed of rebellion, the moment when awareness returns raw and unfiltered, when one person dares to step outside the collective trance and see the machinery for what it is. And that rebellion always begins the same way, not with protest, not with destruction, but with a question. What if everything I believe is wrong? That is the spark, the moment consciousness begins to remember itself. And so we arrive at the threshold of revolution, not political, but psychological. A rebellion of perception. The next step is not to destroy the idols, but to see through them. The rebellion begins in silence, not the silence of passivity, but the silence of awakening, the kind that arrives when the noise of the world begins to sound like static, and you suddenly realize how much of your life has been lived on autopilot. You don't raise a flag or shout in the streets. You sit still, you observe, you begin for the first time in a long time to see. Rebellion in its purest form does not start with rage. It starts with clarity. The world wants you to believe that rebellion means opposition, that to resist one ideology you must embrace another. But true rebellion is not reactive, it is reflective. It is the decision to stop being moved by the tides of conditioning and start steering the ship yourself. It's the act of reclaiming your attention from the forces that profit from your distraction. To break free from ignorance and idolatry, you must first confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that you were complicit. You chose the easy narratives, the comforting lies, the idols that gave you certainty. And now you must choose differently. Carl Jung said that freedom begins when we become conscious of our own unconsciousness. The first act of rebellion, then, is awareness. To see how your thoughts are shaped by invisible hands, media, education, family, fear, and to stop mistaking those influences for your authentic voice. It's not enough to question the world. You must question the self that perceives it. That is where the true revolution begins, inside the architecture of perception itself. The modern mind is trained to seek validation more than truth. Every post, every opinion, every display of awareness is a subtle performance, proof to the tribe that we belong. The rebellion is to withdraw from that theater, to let your thoughts mature in private before offering them to the public, to value understanding over recognition. You must learn to stand in uncertainty without reaching for the crutch of collective opinion. Nietzsche once declared, "You must become who you are." But that becoming is painful. It requires dismantling the false identities you've worn like armor, the ideological, the social, the moral costumes that kept you safe. To rebel against ignorance, you must first endure the loneliness of independent thought. Society fears the thinker because the thinker cannot be controlled. The thinker disrupts the equilibrium of conformity. But this isolation is not punishment, it's purification. The silence that follows separation from the herd is the crucible in which individuality is forged. When you stop seeking approval, you begin to hear the faint hum of your own consciousness. You rediscover the joy of learning not to prove, but to understand. You read not to be informed, but to be transformed. You begin to see that every answer worth having requires the courage to sit in discomfort. This is not an easy path. Ignorance is seductive precisely because it promises relief. To rebel against it is to choose the path of suffering, not masochistically but meaningfully. As Viktor Frankl wrote, "What is to give light must endure burning." The rebel burns willingly, for truth demands nothing less. But rebellion is not only inward, it is ethical. It demands you live in alignment with what you discover, even when it costs you comfort. You cannot awaken and continue to participate in systems that perpetuate blindness. The way you consume, the way you speak, the way you choose, each becomes an act of resistance or submission. The world tells you that your voice is small, that your awareness changes nothing. But that is the lie ignorance needs you to believe. Every system of control, from empire to algorithm, depends on the assumption that individuals are powerless. The rebellion begins the moment you reject that assumption. You begin by reclaiming your attention, because attention is the new currency of control. Turn it away from the endless scroll of outrage and distraction. Use it intentionally, on art that deepens you, on books that challenge you, on conversations that stretch your mind. Attention, when focused, becomes awareness. Awareness, when disciplined, becomes transformation. And as you do, you'll begin to see through the idols. The celebrity you once admired reveals their emptiness. The ideology you once defended exposes its contradictions. The institutions you trusted show their fragility. And in that collapse, something magnificent happens. You realize that truth was never outside you. It was the clarity hidden beneath your conditioning. To live rebelliously is to live consciously. It means noticing the subtleties others overlook, how language manipulates emotion, how convenience masks exploitation, how pleasure numbs purpose. It means choosing slow thought in a world addicted to speed. It means daring to think without seeking permission. But make no mistake, rebellion has a cost. You will be misunderstood. You will lose allies who only valued your agreement. You will outgrow the comfort of belonging. Yet what you gain is incomparable. The ability to see, to choose, to exist on your own terms. And this independence is not isolation, it is communion with something deeper. When you step beyond the idols, you reconnect with what philosophers once called being, the raw, unmediated experience of existence. You see the world not as filtered symbols, but as a living presence. You rediscover wonder. Schopenhauer believed that art was one of the few ways to escape the tyranny of the will, the endless striving and illusion of importance. In rebellion, you begin to live artfully. You engage with life not as a transaction, but as a creation. Every action becomes a brushstroke, every word a note in the symphony of awareness. Freedom is not found in rejecting every system, but in seeing through them, using them without being used by them. You can participate in the world without worshipping it. You can work, consume, connect, but consciously, as an act of choice rather than compulsion. This is the essence of liberation, to no longer be driven by unseen forces, but to direct them with intent. To think critically not as an act of defiance, but as an act of love for truth, for humanity, for the evolution of consciousness itself. And yet, this rebellion is only the beginning. Awareness dismantles the false, but what replaces it? What lies beyond the idols once they crumble? The danger of awakening is that it can leave one suspended in the void, disillusioned but directionless. Once you see through the illusions, what remains to live for? This question, terrifying and sacred, is where the final transformation begins. For rebellion clears the ground, but truth must rebuild upon it. The mind that has freed itself must now discover not just what it rejects, but what it affirms. And that journey leads us into the deepest revelation of all, the moment when ignorance and idolatry are not merely escaped, but transcended. It is here, at the edge of understanding, that the ultimate truth reveals itself. Imagine standing at the edge of everything you've ever believed, the ruins of ideology, the ashes of certainty, the silence after the storm of rebellion. The idols have fallen, the noise has ceased. And for the first time, you are alone with nothing but your own awareness. It is a terrifying freedom. For so long, your mind was occupied with defending beliefs, protecting identities, and finding meaning in systems that demanded your loyalty. Now there is only vastness. The mind panics in this emptiness. It asks, if there are no idols, no doctrines, no fixed truths, what remains? The answer comes not as a word, but as a stillness. You begin to sense that beneath the chaos of opinions and illusions, there is something unbroken, something that cannot be owned, branded, or manipulated. A kind of silent intelligence that has been watching through your eyes all along. It is not yours, and yet it is you. This is the final realization, that truth was never a concept to be possessed. It was the consciousness perceiving all concepts. Ignorance does not mean when you learn something new, but when you recognize the knower within, the awareness that precedes thought, the field in which all perception arises and dissolves. This is the space that religion once called the soul, that mystics called the self, that philosophers called being. The tragedy of idolatry is that it points to the sacred while blinding you to it. You worship symbols of truth rather than truth itself. You bow before prophets, teachers, ideologies, never realizing that what you seek through them is already the essence of what you are. The idols crumble, but consciousness remains. Nietzsche declared that God is dead, not as an act of celebration, but as an obituary for meaning. He saw that humanity had killed its gods, yet failed to replace them with anything transcendent. But perhaps Nietzsche's prophecy was incomplete. Perhaps God, in the old form, had to die so that consciousness could recognize itself as divine, not the God of doctrines, but the awareness that animates all existence, the silent witness of every joy and sorrow, every illusion and awakening. The death of idolatry, then, is not the end of faith, it is the rebirth of reverence, a reverence that no longer points outward, but inward. You begin to see that every philosopher, mystic, and seeker was never giving you answers. They were pointing you back to this seeing. The Taoists called it the way. The Buddhists called it the unborn. Frankl found it in meaning, Jung in individuation, Huxley in direct experience. Each was describing the same destination through different myths, the awakening of consciousness from identification with illusion. You are not the thoughts you think, nor the beliefs you defend. You are the space in which they arise. And once you see this, ignorance loses its power, not because the world becomes simple, but because you no longer need it to be. Ignorance depends on fear. Truth thrives in mystery. You no longer need to cling to the illusion of certainty. You can walk through the chaos of existence with eyes open, knowing that truth is not static but alive. It breathes through paradox, it evolves with perception. The wise do not seek to possess truth. They allow themselves to be transformed by it. This is the ultimate rebellion. To live without idols, yet with reverence. To think critically, yet love unconditionally. To move through illusion without mistaking it for self. From this awareness, everything changes. You stop chasing validation because you no longer need mirrors to confirm your existence. You stop fearing ignorance because you see it for what it is, a veil drawn by the ego to protect itself from its own transparency. You even stop idolizing critical thinking itself, realizing that intellect is but one instrument in the orchestra of understanding. Thinking without awareness breeds arrogance. Awareness without thought breeds wisdom. The death of ignorance, then, is not the triumph of intellect, but the awakening of insight, the silent knowing that precedes reason. It is not the conquest of truth, but the surrender to it. This is what the mystics meant when they said enlightenment is not an achievement, but a remembering. You do not become free. You realize you always were. The world, seen through this lens, no longer appears as a battlefield of ideologies, but as a vast, interconnected expression of consciousness exploring itself. Every belief, every mistake, every act of ignorance becomes part of a larger unfolding. You stop judging and start observing. You stop reacting and start responding. And in that shift from reaction to awareness, the world begins to heal. You realize that ignorance is not humanity's enemy, but its shadow. It is the necessary contrast that allows wisdom to emerge. To curse ignorance is to curse your own evolution. Instead, you hold it gently, as one holds a wounded child. For every act of blindness, every delusion, every idolatry, is born from the same impulse, to find meaning in an incomprehensible universe. When you see this, compassion dawns. You no longer fight the world's ignorance with hostility, but with understanding. You speak truth not to win arguments, but to awaken others to their own seeing. You no longer need to destroy idols. You simply stop feeding them. And perhaps that is the quiet revolution the world has been waiting for. Not a war of ideas, but a remembrance of awareness. From this space, the simplest act becomes sacred. Listening becomes prayer. Observation becomes meditation. Every breath, every word, every moment becomes an opportunity to remember. I am aware. This is the rebirth of critical thinking, not as skepticism, but as consciousness in motion. The thinker is no longer enslaved by thought. They use it as a tool, not an identity. They see truth not as an endpoint, but as an ever-deepening horizon. You finally understand what the philosophers meant when they said, "To know thyself." They were not asking you to analyze your personality or dissect your memories. They were pointing you back to the awareness that perceives both. To know yourself is to know the ground of all being, the silent intelligence behind every form. And when you live from that place, ignorance loses its grip, idolatry dissolves, and critical thinking becomes not rebellion, but reverence. You no longer seek to escape illusion. You dance with it, aware that it is only the surface of something infinite. You no longer chase meaning, you embody it. The death of critical thinking was never about logic or intellect. It was about forgetting what it means to be truly alive, truly conscious, truly human. And so the ultimate truth is not hidden in books or doctrines or algorithms. It is here now in the awareness of reading these words, in the breath between thoughts, in the silence that remains when all idols fall. You are not lost. You were never lost. You were simply dreaming that you were separate from truth, when in reality you were its witness all along. The awakening is simple, yet it changes everything. You are the truth you seek, and when you remember that, ignorance becomes impossible.